Hello, this is Jan Croon, and I'm going to be talking about The War Outside My Window, the Civil War Diary of Leroy Wiley Gresham. And a few things about this slide that I'd like you to notice before we get started. First of all, this is the only image that we have of Leroy, that we know is Leroy. It's part of the Library of Congress collection that holds all of these journals and excellent letters that were written by the family. So this is the only picture that we have of this boy. And so just being able to look at him and know what he looks like makes a difference, I think, when you're reading. Second of all, I wanted you to note the handwriting. He had absolutely beautiful handwriting. So it was a joy really to go through it and read this. Everything is digitized in the Library of Congress collection. So I haven't actually really seen these journals yet. They're very, very protective. And if I want to go in there, I'm going to have to get special permission to see it. And hopefully I'll be able to do that one day. I know the curator and I've been working on her. But I wanted you to notice how beautiful and open his handwriting is. And also to notice that this is the only picture that we do have of him at this time. Hopefully others will pop up. So the Gresham Diary, how it got started, how this whole thing happened. I saw a post in Facebook, of all places, written by a Washington Post author about the Library of Congress sesquicentennial celebration of the beginning of the war. And they call this the jewel of the Civil War collection. One of the jewels, and they have a lot of really amazing things, but this is one of their highlights. And they pulled some of it out, and this author wrote an article that I found was really intriguing. He noted a few things about how bright Leroy was, and that's absolutely true. He noted that something had happened to his left leg, and nobody knew what had happened to his left leg. And they noted also that he had bed sores. And that was really an important part of his writing, was about his medical condition. And they had no idea what the bed sores were due from. So that was one of the first mysteries that I had to work with, was finding out what was wrong. I went to who became my publisher, Ted Savas, and asked him if he'd heard about this, the set of journals. There are 7 in total. He said no, he hadn't. And my interest was, being a high school history teacher, primary sources like this are one way to really get interest from students in a topic. And he's writing nearly every single day during the war. He's writing his own personal day-to-day life. And as I'll explain as we go through, those are also very important, unique aspects of this work. Leroy himself was born in 1847 into a prominent slaveholding family in Macon, Georgia. His father was one of the elders in the Presbyterian Church, provided a lot of the funding for the building of the church, which is still in Macon. He had been elected mayor twice in the 1840s. He was also president of the Macon Manufacturing Company, which was a large cotton mill that employed many, many people. Eventually became part of the Bibb Manufacturing Company and was a major employer in Macon, Georgia for the next 100 years. Leroy kept a diary from 1860 to 1865. He began writing when he was 12 and ended when he was 17, and he wrote in it nearly every day. And Leroy was an invalid. He was sickly. He talks about this a lot. But he's also wicked smart. He's educated, he is kind, curious, and opinionated. So you really do get a really good glimpse through this window into who this young man is. And he was exceptional. These are his parents, Mary Eliza Baxter and John Jones Gresham. This is probably closer to the end of Mary's life. It's on the front porch of their home in Macon, which is now a bed and breakfast. You can go stay at it. It's called the 1842 Inn, and it is a wonderful place to go. Even if you don't go to stay overnight, the employees there and many of them have been working there for decades, have no problem with someone coming in to see where Leroy wrote and where he lived. But these images were taken on the porch of the home that John Gresham built on College Street, which is at kind of the top of a crest in Macon, down as it slopes downward toward the Ocmulgee River is more of the business section in town. Then you had a railroad line and the river, and then a similar bluff on the other side. So you kind of have mirror images geographically, and that becomes important in the story as we go. Gresham owned about 100 slaves in total on 2 plantations about 30 miles south and east of Macon in what is called Houston County. When I first started reading, I thought, they've got plantations in Houston, isn't that a little far? And then I found out that it is Houston County. It's the county just south of Macon, which is in Bibb County. And they called these places Oakwood and Pineland. This next picture, it's a rare hand-colored daguerreotype image of Mary. It was taken in the late 1840s, and it's only half of the picture. Mary is the one to the left, and we believe the woman to the right is her mother, Mary Ann Baxter, who was the only grandparent that the children had during the Civil War. The other 3 had passed on. And what's interesting about some of the pictures that I've collected here for you is that they came along far after the book was published. This was during one of my first road trips through Georgia, talking about the book, and a gentleman came up with a basket and had all sorts of images and documents in it, and this was one of the daguerreotypes. It's very small. It's only about maybe 3 by 4 inches. And again, being hand colored, it's very, very rare. The other 2 images have been obscured by water damage or something, so we cannot see who they are. It's 2 other women. But it's kind of nice to see Mary as she was about the age Leroy would have been born, and then see her in later life. And you can look at the facial features and see how similar they are. We also have a couple of other images of her. Unfortunately, we don't know who owns them, so I can't use them in presentations. But we do believe 99% sure that this is Mary. And Leroy was basically the favorite child in a very, very close family. And this is a close, extended family. I did a lot of genealogical work on this family, and I have 1,701 people on the Ancestry.com chart. And I can't find where 3 people belong on that chart. So still have to keep working on that. Also in that gentleman's basket were these 2 images. And when I saw the one of Thomas, I got really excited because Leroy writes about when this picture was made. And so it was something I'd been trying to find. And I was just blown away that this gentleman actually had it, not knowing who it was. But this is Thomas, the young man in the 2 pictures. He was the first of the Gresham's children. He was born in 1844. And he was a very, I don't want to say a misbehaving young man, but he was a very active young man. Would get in all kinds of little scrapes, would do things like pour pebbles down grandma's drain spouts when they went to visit grandmother, who lived in Athens, Georgia. Thomas and Leroy were extremely close. They were not twins. There's 3 years between them, but as is not unheard of with twins, they had a language between them that only the 2 of them could understand. Their mother writes about this. And that signifies how close these 2 boys were. Minnie was the only daughter. She was well educated, as Thomas and Leroy were. She attended the all-girls school Wesleyan Female College, which was literally a block away from the house at the time, and was selected to read her junior thesis at one point, which was a high honor. One of the unexpected pleasures of this book is you get to read about Thomas and Minnie's life as well, and you get to see about what it was like for girls who were teenagers, what it was like for them to grow up. And for her to read in public a serious essay was a real honor. She presented in the auditorium in town. It was open to the public. And it was curious to me because everybody was there, and Leroy was sitting outside. The family's servants, they were all inside listening to their young lady recite, but Leroy sat in his wagon outside, and I couldn't figure out why that would happen. I'll explain about the wagon in a minute. But she ended up becoming an authoress in her own right. Her middle son, she married and had 3 boys. He became a very important Presbyterian theologian. It had quite a history as well. So it was education was extremely important to this family. There are 2 other younger siblings that died in infancy. Edmund was 7 months old. He was named after John Gresham's older brother. And we know that he died of complications of pneumonia because of one of the letters that the gentleman had in his basket. We don't know about Edward. He was 17 months old. And I've got several letters to go through that are part of the Library of Congress collection, and hopefully be able to find out more about little Edward. So that is the nuclear family, if you want to say, the Greshams who lived on College Street. But why the diary? That's the focal point here. I found out what happened with Leroy's leg. That was one of the things, is to find out why they were going on this trip. And he had been, his leg had been crushed in 1856. I found an account written by a man who later became a Georgia judge. And he said that after school, the boys who had heard that there had been a burning at one of the buildings in town, the Washington building, it burned to the ground. And after school, the boys from the same school that Leroy and his brother and sister went to decided they were going to go into town and check it out. And when they did, this wooden structure that had just recently burned had one standing feature, and that was the brick chimney. Judge Ayers said he recalled yelling to the boys that the chimney was starting to rock and that they needed to scramble. And the little boy standing next to him bought the brunt of it, and his left leg was crushed. He was never able to use it again, and he died shortly after the Civil War. And that was our Leroy. So he was often pulled in a wagon because he couldn't walk. It would be either a slave companion, a boy named Allen that his parents brought up from the plantation. Friends of his or his brother would pull him around town. So either that or in a horse and carriage would be the way that he would get around. He developed a cough in 1857 and then back abscesses by 1860. And those were the abscesses, the bed sores that the Washington Post author discussed. And it was those sores that John Gresham was particularly worried about. So he took his son to Philadelphia in June of 1860 to see Dr. Joseph Pancoast. Dr. Pancoast was one of the premier doctors of the age. He was one of the first physicians in the United States to practice what we now call plastic surgery. And what we think is that John wanted Dr. Pancoast to close the wounds on Leroy's back. He had 2 seeping sores, and he wanted to see if Dr. Pancoast could do anything about it. So they took a trip together, father and son, to Philadelphia, and that starts the whole journal. The journal was a gift. The first diary, pocket size, not very big, was a gift from his mother, just to keep track of what happened while they were gone. And as it turned out, Dr. Pancoast couldn't do anything for Leroy, who was very disappointed by this. He really had an affinity for Dr. Pancoast and mentions him several times. At one point, even writing that he was so excited that he heard, saw Dr. Pancoast's name in the newspaper, that he had tended to General Kearney when he was killed at the Battle of Chantilly. And then in parentheses, he writes, I was excited to see Dr. Pancoast's name, not General Kearney. And he brings him up every so often. But his personality, he was highly educated. He was curious about everything. He loved mathematics. that was one of his favorite topics. He likes science, especially astronomy. He talks several times about meteor showers or comets that they see in the night sky, and writes about those. He is inquisitive, talkative, sweet, funny, and kind. There's no evidence of sibling rivalry in this. If you think in a private journal, he would write about if he had problems with his brother or sister, and you don't see any of that. He loved pets. He seemed to have a good relationship with everyone he came across, especially the servants, the slaves that worked in the household, and even the ones down on the plantation who we get to know as they come back and forth. He had several dogs, all named after Confederate generals, and just wanted to have lots of animals. He's opinionated. He had an opinion about everything, including Thomas's photo, which he didn't like. And that's one of the reasons I was curious to find it, because he said it was a total failure. And I thought, wow, that doesn't seem like a total failure. It looks like a serious young man who's about to go off to war, who's 20 years old, in the third year of the war. It was taken in 1864. And it probably was because it was a different Thomas that Leroy saw in that image, not the happy-go-lucky Thomas that he saw every day and was very attached to. And the entries include some Mark Twain witty phrases, like the one I mentioned about General Kearney. And I took a screenshot of this one. You see the scribbling there. It was either one of two people in the household. One would have been Florence, the daughter of one of the servants, who was born the day Leroy's leg was broken, ironically enough. She would have been about 5 at the time. This is 1862. The other one would have been his cousin, who would have come up to the house on a regular basis. Little Tracy's mother had died before he was a year old. His father was a surgeon in the one of the Georgia armies. And he writes at the top, some jackass got hold of this book and tried his hand at writing. I think it's probably Tracy, not Florence, but who knows. But that was just one of the things that was in there. The diary provides you a really unique view of Southern family life in the 19th century. You see daily life. Unlike a lot of journals that are written by women and girls, they talk about what happens, and then every so often things wane. You don't get an entry for a month or so until something new and exciting happens. Leroy only about 4 days of the entirety of the war. He writes every day. So you get a real good glimpse about the community and about the changes that they go through. He describes the food, the clothing, the conversations, the interactions, the stream of visitors. They had several very important people who came through, which he talks about. I would spoil some of the reading for you if I told you about all of them. But one of them happened to be Woodrow Wilson's father, who was a prominent Presbyterian minister in Augusta, Georgia, when they had their annual Presbytery meetings. He was at the house a couple of times. You follow the Greshams from the peak of their influence through the impact that the defeat in the war had on the family and on the community. At one point at the beginning, Leroy mentions, oh, father got a new carriage and I forgot to write about it. It's a significant kind of purchase and something you think that he would have remembered to write about since he wrote every day. And then towards the end, he's writing about how his father was using family silver to get him a nutritious meal in 1865 and not knowing if they were going to have a home in the next year, that last Christmas that he was around. So you get to see them change quite a bit. I've included a list of major individuals in Leroy's life, explain who the community people were, and some of the relatives and how they're related to one another. I needed to know which Aunt Nancy was as opposed to Cousin Nancy, which one of the 70-some women who have the name of Elizabeth or Eliza that he was talking about from the family tree. So that was a big part of the background work for this, was finding all the family people. He talks about the politics. Here we've got Jefferson Davis, Joe Brown, and Alex Stevens. He follows politics and especially gets involved after secession. He loved Jefferson Davis. He knows a lot about his background as the previous Secretary of War, his role in the Mexican Wars, and also being a congressman, senator. He thinks that Jefferson Davis writes well, speaks well, and he thinks that the Davis-Stevens ticket, he says, is a prime ticket. He despises Georgia Governor Joe Brown. And this only deepens as the war continues. Georgia elected governors every other year. And the third time that Joe Brown is elected, which is during the war, Leroy has problems with this. He thinks that's not right. And when he's elected the fourth term, Leroy says that this is just, this is horrible. This is an embarrassment. Alex Stevens, he doesn't say very much about, except that living in Athens, Alex Stevens was known to the family and would occasionally bring mail to grandmother from Richmond. So he has kind of a different twist on some of these people because they're known to the family personally, as Alex Stevens was. He's young, so his views are probably like my ninth graders. And I taught in Fairfax County for about 17 years. The ninth graders, you can tell that they're mimicking what they hear politically at home, especially during election years. And you kind of get a sense of that from Leroy at the beginning as well. He agrees with his father. He's happy about secession. And he mocks Lincoln and Northern soldiers, which is common. You've ever seen Dr. Seuss's book of cartoons from World War II, his political cartoons. They are just breathtaking, and not in a good way, because he uses every single stereotype about the Italians, the Japanese, and the Germans that you can find. My students were just astounded that it wasn't red fish, one fish, two fish, red fish, blue fish. This was really awful stuff. But that's what happens in wartime. And Leroy tells a story about the first skirmish in Fairfax Courthouse, very close to where I live personally, where the Union cavalry pushed into town at night to see how the Confederates were holding the town, how well supported they were. They came in, there was a little bit of fighting, a little bit of shooting, then they left. Leroy says he knows how the North is arming, producing its army. It's kicking all the drunkards out of the bars and giving them guns and sending them to shoot up the women and children of Fairfax Courthouse. Well, that's not exactly true, but that's how you see kind of how they're doing things through Leroy's eyes. Those are kind of the amusing political things. He does, again, follow this very closely. He notices quickly there's an animosity that's very personal between Davis and Governor Brown. Davis would call for a day of Thanksgiving in the Confederacy. In Georgia, it would be declared a week and a half later. So they were always at each other, and Leroy notices this. He writes about every battle that you could think of. He keeps really good accounts of what happens during the war. I've told people, if you don't know a thing about the Civil War, you don't have to, because Leroy will tell you about it as it happens. And he covers everything from the Army of Northern Virginia to the Army of the Tennessee to the Army of the Trans-Mississippi, the Navy, what the militia is doing, what the blockade runners are doing. He knows the names of the ships that the blockade runners use. And he writes about them in very, very good detail. Footnotes help readers follow it because occasionally he will use other names that are not familiar. Like in this clip here, the Battle of Richmond. Well, we know it historically today as the Peninsula Campaign. So he's writing about, it says Old Stonewall is in his rear, and he's talking about McClellan. So it's the Battle of Richmond. He talks about the Battle of Leesburg, which again is less than 5 miles from my home. And we know it as the Battle of Ball's Bluff, not the Battle of Leesburg. So when there's inconsistencies like that, or things that might be confusing, made sure that those notations were taken into account. He got news from his father, from newspapers, magazines, other adults. He particularly prized letters from the several uncles and cousins that were at the front. He's interested in how the Georgia troops are doing at the front, or as they called it, the seat of war. You can see perceptible mood swings in his writing as the South wins and loses battles. And I think it's probably most prominent about these mood swings when he's writing about Vicksburg in that campaign. Oh, we're going to get them this week, and then it doesn't happen, and they get all upset. So Sherman and the Georgia campaign are well covered. Leroy saw some of the side shooting of the war from his roof. The summer of 1864, Sherman sent one of the cavalry units, George Stoneman's unit, to get the prisoners out of Andersonville. While Stoneman's cavalry was captured in Macon, and Leroy, how he got up to the roof, someone must have had to carry him. His father was in the militia, his brother was gone, but he was up on the roof and said he could see the cannonballs coming into town. He saw where one hit Judge Asa Holt's house. It's known as the Cannonball House in Macon today. It was the only civilian structure, the home structure that was damaged. So you have a lot of really good antebellum architecture that still exists in Macon. But the cannonball came from that bluff across the river that I spoke about before. They fired it almost 2 miles. The cannonball, that particular one, bounced in the front yard, went through the colonnade that was at the front of the house and into the parlor as Mrs. Holt was coming down the stairs. And Leroy mentions the next day, the Holts have left town. Don't blame them. Processing the news was one of the really interesting aspects of this because nobody knows what's happening. It's not like today where you can pick up your cell phone and almost follow what's happening internationally as it happens. They had to wait to get information, and there was no real organized way to do that. The newspapers ended up picking up the slack in notifying families of what might have happened to their loved ones in battle. So if you remember the scene from Gone with the Wind where they're waiting to find out whether Ashley's been killed at Gettysburg, that's very realistic. They would have those lists come out and the newspapers publish them. So he quickly learns that everything he reads is not true. One of my friends, as she's going through, when the book first came out, she didn't remember much. She told me from the Civil War. I said, that's okay, Leroy will teach you. And she goes, why is it every time Leroy mentions a battle, there's all these Federals that are killed, but hardly any conservatives? And I said, well, his hopes are high that things went well, but they're also dealing with fake news. So they find out things are incorrect, intentionally sometimes, unintentionally at others. And he just has to take it for what it is, and he learns to question the news as it comes out. And his diary lets us see how civilians would process this information. When General Hood is wounded, one day he's dead, and the next day he's wounded, and another day he's okay. It had to wait for that to filter out. The clips that I got here, the two of them, the newsprint one, the Southern newspapers would sometimes use Federal newspaper clips. If they didn't have enough news in their own to fill in, they would use what were in the Yankee newspapers. And that is a clipping that was in Leroy's journal. It is from the Macon Telegraph, and it's from the New York Herald. And then he writes down here, the one that's in his handwriting, Mr. Clisby, who he writes about, was the editor of the Macon Telegraph and came to the home to speak to his father on the 7th of July. And Leroy knows that Lee has crossed the Potomac for a second time, and they're off somewhere, and he wants to know if there's been any information, any news. And Mr. Clisby says, well, there's a skirmish. But as Leroy writes here, Mr. Clisby thinks it was not a large affair. If you look at the date, it's July 7, 1863. That skirmish that wasn't much of an affair was Gettysburg. And they still don't know the vast human damage that was taken at Gettysburg in 3 days of fighting. On the 7th of July, they still don't know about it in the South. The next few pages are nothing but Gettysburg after this. And Leroy actually had a blue piece of paper where it was like he wrote an essay about it and how he processed the whole Gettysburg event, which is really interesting to read. Slavery is a theme that's always there, but not really spoken much about directly. I had to look at official documents to find out how many slaves the Greshams owned. They had 93 slaves on their plantations down in Houston County. And using the 1860s Census Schedule B, which is the slavery schedules, you can find out that there were 93 individuals. They're all listed. They gives you the gender, the age, and the degree of color of the individual, whether they were, the Virginia Schedule B uses the term full black, others were black or mulatto. And that's all you know about these people. No names are used. The same is true of the staff that they had in Macon itself. But you get to know who those people are because Leroy mentions them every single day. He had affection for a lot of these people. You can see Julia Ann, the way he wrote her name so beautifully in just a regular sentence. She was Florence's mother, actually. She was a seamstress. She worked in the house as like an undermaid. There was another woman who was Mrs. Gresham's personal maid, but she kind of directed the inside the house work. The cook was Mary. There was a man named Howard who was, I would call him the caretaker of the household. He was in charge of making sure they ran smoothly. He and Leroy were very close. You could see Leroy following Howard around as best he could. Howard taught Leroy how to plant vegetables and fruit. His favorite fruit was cantaloupe. This kid had a real sweet tooth. And interestingly enough, these photographs I chose were stock photographs. The one at the bottom, there's an interesting person in there. I'm going to see if anybody who can figure it out, and we'll talk about it at the end. But he describes how the plantation crops supported the family home and how the family supported the people in the plantation. They had cotton come up. Slaughtering of hogs in the fall was a big deal because that was wealth in a time where cotton was no longer able to be sold. It's important to remember that Leroy was born into this, so he didn't really know anything else. His father, at one point in a separate letter that's not part of the journals, wrote about going down to Houston early before the war, and it was spring. And he had a hard time getting through all of the fields on a horse. And he told his wife he was writing to that he felt really bad for the slaves because they didn't even have a horse, that they were walking by foot, barefoot. And he says, it makes me even wish I didn't own a slave. So that is what he says. The only thing he says about slavery directly is in early 1865. He agrees with his father that emancipation should be gradual, not sudden. And we do know how that ended up happening. He was terminally ill, and that's apparent throughout. But as we're running along, we didn't know what it was. Had no idea, because Leroy was never told what it was he was dealing with. He was not told what he was actually brought up to see Dr. Pancoast for. Approximately 70% of people at the time Leroy was writing carried the disease he had, but they were healthy and their bodies allowed them to suppress it. He was terminally ill with a rare form of tuberculosis. and his parents chose not to tell him. His version of disease is known as Pott's disease. And this is a picture of the vertebrae, what happens to it in Potts' dissertation about this disease, also called spinal tuberculosis. And it still exists in some of what we used to call the third world. I have a physician myself who is from Pakistan, and he told me they're very familiar with it there, that people who can't afford to go to a doctor or don't go to a doctor early enough or live in remote areas of the country will come down with this. So it's something that is still dealt with in other parts of the world. So I had no idea what it was he was dealing with. He wrote about his symptoms, remedies, pain, and his treatment in great detail. And my publisher asked me to collect all that data and send it to another one of his authors who is a surgeon, and Dr. Can you fit here? The doctor that we sent it to was able to give us the diagnosis. He also told us that this is the only detailed tuberculosis account written by a patient in the 19th century. And it's really important because Leroy did not know what he had. And this explains several things to me. Recall I told you about him having to sit outside when his sister gave her presentation in public, which was a huge deal for many. He ended up sitting outside because he has tuberculosis. He could not go into a crowded auditorium. He had to be outside. This is why he doesn't go to school anymore, why he doesn't go to church. This is an incredibly religious family. Leroy only reads religious texts on Sundays, but he couldn't go to church. And when he was welcomed into the Presbyterian church, the elders had to come to him to welcome him in here. And his pain was real significant. You can see it says, saw off my leg. It's only one of several times he writes that in his journals. What's interesting is you can see a parallel decline between the South and Leroy's health. And he even notices this, things are going bad for the country, and they're going even worse for him. This picture here is also from Potts' writing. It shows the whole spine. So you can see where the problems would be. As 1865 arrived, he began to take more morphine. He tells you how many grains of morphine he's taking. He grew weaker. The pain he described was horrendous. And he started worrying about his right foot, his good foot, drawing up, is how he puts it. And when you see the curvature in the spine there, you can kind of see how he would be losing the ability to move because the nerves are getting pinched, which is painful if you've ever had that kind of nerve pain. It's excruciating. And so he said, yes, I haven't been able to use my left leg for years. My right leg is going too. Pretty soon I'm not going to have a leg to stand on at all. So even through all this, he's still keeping his sense of humor. But it become even more useless. Journaling took his mind off of the disease. And when things that were exciting were happening, he writes less about the medical aspect of his life and more about what's happening around him that he's observing. The handwriting in May began to change, April and May. And by the end of May, it was always no longer his beautiful handwriting, but the handwriting in this letter here, which was written by his mother. The last entry is on June 8th, 1865, and you can very clearly see, I am, and then that third word is obscured. It's like when he was dictating to his mother, who's writing down all of his thoughts, she wasn't able to actually finish that word. And she also, this is the first page of this heartbreaking 7-page letter to her sister describing the details of his final hours. The death, the burial are included in the book. He dies on June 18th, 1865. So her letter fills in those 10 days. You also get a sense of the way things are deteriorating between the slaves in society and the slave owners. kind of get a foretelling of what Reconstruction is going to be like. And he's chronicling the decline of the Old South, which parallels his own decline and his own death. So it's really a rather remarkable parallel, which one gentleman at a Civil War roundtable I presented at in Ohio said was Shakespeare couldn't have written something as good as this. It really is heartbreaking. So his gift to history is, this is the only teenage male non-combatant account of the Civil War. Ted, at the very beginning, Ted Savas, my publisher, asked me to read as many journals like Leroy's that I could find. And I'd already read several written by men who had written with Stonewall Jackson and also with Jeb Stuart. I'd read Mosby's accounts of the war. I'd read some by a woman, Annie Froebel. Ironically enough, at one point, her brother was Thomas's military commander. She was from Fairfax County. I thought that was interesting. And also several other women's accounts, but I couldn't find anything exactly like that. So it's the only one where the male is not going off to war. They were always in the war or writing journals afterwards. It's the only insider view of a prominent Southern family during the Civil War. People might ask, well, what about Mary Chestnut? Well, Mary Chestnut wasn't really like, it wasn't a normal existence. Her best friend was Verena Davis, and she had, her journal is fascinating, but it's not an everyday, this is what happened on this day, this is what we had for dinner kind of thing. The only detailed diary in the world of the course and treatment of tuberculosis. Dr. Rosbach also put together a more comprehensive view of tuberculosis and Leroy's situation in particular in this book, this companion book. He does have a medical foreword and afterwards in the journals book, but this goes into more detail if you're interested in more detail. And I told Ted at the end, I said, the only diary I can think of that's even remotely like Leroy's is the diary of Anne Frank. And he paused. We were doing text messaging. He goes, "You have to explain this one to me." We got on the phone. And the commonalities are not perfect. They're not exactly the same. Anne is hiding in an attic. Her family, her whole family is there. They're hiding away. Their lives are in danger. As a matter of fact, she's being persecuted for her religion. And the Nazi regime is out looking for her sister, and that's when they go into hiding in Amsterdam. Leroy's not hiding from anybody. He has a disease inside him that he doesn't know what it is, and it's killing him. And so it removes him from society, not willingly, but they're both removed from society. They both describe what is happening to the people around them in great detail. You can kind of, if you feel like you're there, you really get to know these people. Leroy he's so charming. Everybody falls in love with him. He's really, really a wonderful kid. And as you get towards the end of it, it's really rather sad what happens. Anne's diary ends very abruptly, of course, because they are captured and taken away. So as we recognize Anne Frank as the young voice of World War II, we look at Leroy as the young voice of the Southern Confederacy. And to that end, a friend and I, she teaches middle school English in New England. She and I have put together a curriculum guide to go with The War Outside My Window. And we're finishing up working on a version that's more set for 5th through 8th graders, for younger readers, that will allow them to get to know Leroy as well. It's also got a curriculum guide that goes with it. So you can get not only the literary vision of Leroy's story, but also its historic significance. So that is what I have for you. We'll take a look at your questions. If you think of any while we're going over those questions, just let me know and we will have our discussion. Thank you very much.